Miss Hattie stepped out into the brisk morning air with the quiet grace of someone who'd seen decades of change and endured each one with dignity. At 78 years old, her frame was petite but proud, draped in a lavender wool coat with pearl buttons and a matching hat that sat neatly atop silver curls. Her gloved hands clutched a brown leather handbag. Inside it, her pension deposit slip, her checkbook, and a folder of neatly organized documents. The bank had been her institution of choice for over 40 years, and though ownership had changed, the building itself still held echoes of a time when handshakes mattered and people were treated as neighbors, not numbers. As she walked through the glass doors, she gave a polite nod to the receptionist and took her place in line, waiting patiently with the gentle patience that only time could teach. The bank's lobby buzzed with muted chatter, the clicking of keyboards, and the occasional hum of the printer. When it was her turn, she approached the counter with a warm smile. "Good morning, young man," she said softly to the teller. Travis, a young man in his mid-20s with a carefully styled fade and the confidence of someone who thought he was more important than he was, barely looked up. "Do you have an appointment?" he said curtly. Miss Hattie paused, not out of confusion but disbelief. "No, I've never needed one before. I'm just here to deposit this and ask a few questions." Travis sighed audibly and shook his head, already annoyed. "Ma'am, this is a busy branch. We don't have time to explain every little thing. You need to talk to an advisor if you're asking about loans. This window is for basic transactions only." His tone was dismissive, lacking the courtesy that even strangers deserved. She held her ground, her smile never faltering but her eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm aware of how banks work. I've been a client here longer than you've been alive." That earned a sarcastic smirk from Travis, who leaned over the counter as if he were doing her a favor. "Well, things change. Maybe you should go to one of our smaller branches. Might be easier for you to understand." The insult stung not because it was overt, but because it was coded in condescension, the kind that comes when someone assumes age and race equal ignorance. Miss Hattie tried to keep her voice calm. "I would appreciate it if you simply processed this deposit. Then I'll wait to speak to an advisor." But Travis didn't move. He looked her up and down with a mixture of pity and impatience. "Do you even have an account here? This might not be the place you're thinking of. I can print out a branch list if that helps." Several heads turned. The disrespect was becoming more noticeable, but no one spoke up. Miss Hattie's fingers clutched her handbag a little tighter. She didn't raise her voice, didn't make a scene. "I've had an account here for 4 decades, young man. The branch manager even attended my retirement celebration 2 years ago." But Travis wasn't listening. He waved over a colleague and muttered something under his breath. The colleague, a young woman named Janelle, glanced at Miss Hattie and gave her a sympathetic smile before looking at the screen and confirming, "Yes, she's had this account since 1981. Travis didn't apologize. He just rolled his eyes. "Fine, but I don't have time to sit here all day explaining paperwork. You'll need to go sit down." Then he pointed toward the chairs like he was directing traffic, not a valued client. The sting of humiliation burned under Miss Hattie's carefully composed exterior. The insult wasn't just in the words, it was in the way he spoke them, in the assumption that she was confused, outdated, irrelevant. As she turned to walk toward the waiting area, something in the room shifted. Someone else had noticed, not just with their eyes, but with a growing sense of indignation. The quiet observer stood a few feet back in line, sunglasses on, cap pulled low. He watched the exchange unfold from beginning to end, jaw tightening with every passing moment. Mark Wahlberg hadn't planned to visit the bank that morning. He was in town filming and had stepped in quietly to handle some business. But watching someone speak to a woman like that, his mother's age, his grandmother's grace, made his blood boil. And though he hadn't spoken yet, he knew he wouldn't be able to stay silent much longer. Miss Hattie eased herself into one of the hard plastic waiting chairs, her purse still clutched in her lap like a shield, her composure intact but her spirit slightly bruised. She had encountered microaggressions before, but something about being spoken to like a child in a place that once welcomed her felt like a new kind of betrayal. Her eyes scanned the room, hoping for a familiar face. Maybe someone from the old neighborhood, but all she saw were strangers pretending not to have noticed what had just happened. She glanced back toward the counter where Travis now laughed with another teller, already moving on like her dignity hadn't just been flattened under his indifference. A couple near the entrance looked in her direction, whispered something between themselves, then turned their attention back to their phones. A man in a business suit gave her a sympathetic glance but quickly looked away when she met his eyes, afraid to involve himself. The silence around her grew louder than any shouting ever could. When Janelle came to retrieve her, Miss Hattie stood up slowly, holding her check in one hand and her folder in the other. "Let's see what we can do for you," Janelle said, trying to soften the moment, but her nervous smile betrayed the tension in the air. They walked together to a small desk in the corner, surrounded by plexiglass dividers and potted plastic plants that tried and failed to give the place warmth. Miss Hattie sat, and Janelle pulled up her account. "It looks like your deposit's ready to process. And you wanted to ask about a personal loan?" Miss Hattie nodded. "Yes, I was hoping to apply for a small line of credit to help fund a community literacy program I've been organizing. The church is backing me, but I wanted to front some of the costs myself." Janelle hesitated. "I'll check what you're pre-approved for, but I'll need a manager to finalize anything." A few keystrokes later, her brows lifted slightly in surprise. "Wow, your credit score is excellent," she muttered. "I see multiple assets listed, and your savings are substantial." Miss Hattie gave a light chuckle. "Yes, child. I've always believed in saving for a rainy day, and this country's given me a few storms." Just as Janelle was pulling up the application form, Travis walked over uninvited, still chewing gum, still holding that air of undeserved authority. "Why is she back here?" he asked Janelle directly, ignoring Miss Hattie entirely. "She's trying to apply for a line of credit," Janelle said cautiously. "I already told her this isn't the right place for that," Travis snapped. "She needs to schedule an appointment through the app. You can't just let anyone walk in here and tie up staff time." Miss Hattie straightened in her seat, now facing him fully. "You're speaking about me like I'm not here, and I don't appreciate that." Travis smirked. "I'm just trying to keep things efficient. We can't have people coming in expecting special treatment just because they're old." The audacity of the statement struck the entire room silent. Janelle's mouth opened slightly, too stunned to say anything. Even the customers nearby froze, waiting to see what would happen next. "I've earned every wrinkle on this face and every dollar in that account," Miss Hattie said calmly, yet her voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the effort of holding back years of unspoken frustration. "And I deserve the same respect as anyone else in this building." At that moment, the branch manager, a sharply dressed woman named Denise, approached the desk, clearly summoned by Travis. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, already siding with her employee by tone alone. "This customer doesn't have an appointment and is demanding services outside protocol." Travis chimed in before anyone else could respond. Miss Hattie remained seated, her hands folded neatly on her folder. "I'm not demanding anything. I'm simply trying to access the financial services I've paid into for decades. If your policy has changed, then perhaps you should change your tone as well." Denise gave her a tight-lipped smile, the kind used to pacify rather than understand. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we have procedures. We're happy to help if you'd like to come back another time." The quiet gasp from a woman in the corner suggested not everyone in the bank had bought into the farce. Still, no one stepped forward. Not the man with the briefcase, not the young woman with earbuds in, not even the security guard who stood near the entrance with his arms folded, eyes scanning but never settling on the scene unfolding. Miss Hattie stood slowly, her strength no longer just in her posture but in her restraint. "I'll leave, not because I should, but because I won't allow anyone to rob me of my dignity." She gathered her things and turned, but before she could take a full step, a voice rang out from behind her, low but firm. "She's not going anywhere." Every head in the lobby turned. Mark Wahlberg had removed his sunglasses and stepped forward, his Boston accent unmistakable as he spoke with quiet authority. "You're treating this woman like she's invisible, but I saw the whole thing, and you're not gonna pretend it didn't happen." Denise blinked, recognizing him immediately, but unsure of what to do. "Sir, this doesn't concern you," she began, but Mark cut her off. "It concerns everyone with a conscience. And I think it's time someone actually listens to her." Mark Wahlberg stood with the weight of the room suddenly shifting toward him, the silence breaking under the force of his words like glass under pressure. Miss Hattie turned slightly, her eyes meeting his, and for a moment she saw not a celebrity, but an ally, someone unwilling to look away when it was easier to remain silent. He stepped forward slowly, removing his cap as a sign of respect, his tone even but firm. "You all saw what just happened. You saw the way she was talked to, dismissed, humiliated like her time didn't matter, like her presence didn't belong. And not one of you said anything." The manager's face tensed, her mouth opening to offer a corporate-style deflection. But Mark kept going, walking closer to Miss Hattie's side. This woman didn't yell. She didn't demand anything unreasonable. She walked in here with grace, with patience, and instead of being helped, she was handled like a problem to be tossed aside. Travis had now taken a step back, his swagger fading, his bravado shrinking beneath the spotlight now cast on his actions. Several customers were frozen in place, some staring at Mark in awe, others now feeling the creeping shame of their own silence. "You know," Mark said, looking directly at the bank manager, "where I come from, respect isn't optional. You don't get to decide who deserves it based on how old they are, what they're wearing, or the color of their skin." Miss Hattie, still standing with her documents in hand, looked at Mark with quiet gratitude, her fingers trembling slightly. Not from fear or humiliation now, but from the emotional shock of finally being defended after so many minutes of invisible suffering. "I don't know who you think you're talking to," Denise said, trying to recapture control of the moment. "But this is a private institution, and I'll have to ask you to leave if you continue to disrupt." Mark's laugh cut through the air, sharp and disbelieving. "Disrupt? Lady, the only thing that's been disrupted is the illusion that this place gives a damn about its customers. I watched your teller question if she even had an account here. I watched him laugh behind her back. I watched you ignore the truth of the situation just to avoid holding your team accountable." The silence returned, now heavier, pressing on every corner of the room. "And you think I'm the problem?" he said. "You're lucky this is all I'm doing right now." He turned toward Miss Hattie. "You mind if I sit with you for a minute?" She nodded, too stunned to say much, and the two of them walked back to the chair she had just vacated. He helped her sit and then pulled up a seat beside her, leaning slightly forward with his elbows on his knees. "I'm Mark," he said softly. "I know who you are," she replied with a faint smile. "My granddaughter watches all your movies. I always preferred the one where you played that teacher who turned the whole school around." He grinned. "That was a good one." For the next few minutes, they sat together, the tension in the room slowly deflating as whispers rippled through the crowd. One customer slipped quietly out the door, embarrassed by their inaction. Another approached the counter, asked for a manager, then changed their mind when they realized the environment hadn't changed enough yet. "What's your name?" Mark asked her. "Hattie Dupree," she answered. "I was a school principal for 30 years, ran a youth center after retirement, and now I'm trying to start a literacy project for adults who never had a chance to finish school." He blinked, then smiled, amazed. "You're kind of a badass, Miss Hattie." She laughed gently, but it was laced with emotion. "They treated me like I was confused, like I was wasting their time. It's funny, I've taught kids who grew up to run companies, build cities, write books. But today, I walked into this bank, and I was nobody to them." "Well, you're not nobody to me," he said. "And you're not nobody to anyone who actually has a heart." Meanwhile, Travis had quietly moved to the back, whispering to another employee, clearly shaken. Denise stood stiffly near the counter, unsure of what to do, afraid to escalate the situation further, but equally unwilling to apologize. Mark stood again. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to call someone higher than you. Someone who doesn't look at customers like numbers. Because if you don't, I will. And I guarantee that call's going to go a lot harder for you than it would if you handled this now." The threat was calm, Not loud or aggressive, but it landed with force. Denise swallowed hard, picked up the phone, and stepped into her office without a word. Moments later, the receptionist informed them that a regional manager had been contacted and would be arriving shortly. Miss Hattie looked at Mark, still processing the whirlwind of support. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "A lot of people would have just walked away." He leaned back and said, "That's the problem, Miss Hattie. Too many people walk away, and it's time someone stayed." As the air inside the bank grew thick with unspoken tension, Mark remained close to Miss Hattie, his presence a shield of quiet defiance. She sat composed, not because she had something to prove, but because dignity had always been her way of reclaiming power in the face of disregard. Travis reemerged briefly from the back office but avoided making eye contact, his earlier cockiness now diluted by embarrassment. The receptionist whispered nervously into her headset while customers began quietly shuffling around, unsure if they should stay or leave. Mark leaned over to Miss Hattie again and asked softly, "Are you sure you're okay?" She smiled warmly. "I've lived through far worse, son. But that doesn't mean I should have to keep living through it." He nodded with respect, realizing that her grace was not weakness, but rather the hardened steel of survival wrapped in softness. A few minutes later, Denise returned from her office, her posture stiff but slightly more cautious than before. "The regional director is on his way," she said in clipped tones. "He'll be here shortly." Mark raised his eyebrows. "Good. Maybe he can teach you how to talk to customers like human beings." She offered no response and walked away, pretending to be busy with paperwork at her desk. While they waited, Mark asked Miss Hattie more about her literacy project. She told him how the idea came from a friend who had confided in her about never learning to read well and how the shame had followed him his entire life. "There are more people like that than you'd think," she explained. "And I figured, why not help them now? It's never too late to learn." Mark listened intently, humbled by how someone who had just been humiliated could still talk about giving to others with so much clarity and care. "You ever think about turning it into a bigger thing?" he asked. "Like a non-profit? Or even a foundation?" Miss Hattie chuckled. "I thought about it, but between grant paperwork and red tape, I figured I'd just start where I could, with a room, some books, and time." Mark looked at her and smiled. "Let's talk more about that later. I might be able to help." Before she could respond, the doors opened and in walked a sharply dressed black man in his early 50s, holding a leather binder and flanked by two assistants. The staff behind the counters straightened up like students caught cheating mid-exam. Denise stood quickly and walked over to greet him. "Mr. Reynolds, thank you for coming," she said, attempting professionalism. "We've had a bit of a misunderstanding. Is this about Miss Hattie Dupree?" he asked, cutting through the facade. Denise paused. "Yes, sir." He gave her a look that said everything without needing a single extra word. Then he walked directly over to Miss Hattie, who stood politely when she saw him approach. "Miss Dupree," he said with genuine warmth. "It's been a while. I saw your photo last year when we sponsored that church fundraiser. I didn't expect to run into you like this." "Nor did I," she said gently. "But I suppose life always finds a way to test our patience." He turned to Mark, instantly recognizing him. "Mr. Wahlberg, I heard you were involved in the incident. Thank you for stepping in." Mark simply nodded. "Just did what was right." Mr. Reynolds turned back to Miss Hattie. "I am so sorry. What happened here today is unacceptable. I've already reviewed the call logs and transaction logs. I know you've been banking with us for over 4 decades. I see your account status. I see the assets you've entrusted with us. And frankly, it's appalling you were treated this way by anyone under this roof." Denise fidgeted uncomfortably as he continued. "Travis has been placed on immediate suspension, and I'll be personally reviewing this branch's performance. We'll also be conducting an internal audit of customer service practices, starting with mandatory training focused on age, race, and income bias." Murmurs spread through the room, and even the security guard looked surprised by how quickly the tide had turned. "Furthermore," he added, "I'd like to offer you our platinum tier banking services, with no fees and full access to a dedicated advisor. Not because of what happened, but because you deserved it years ago. Miss Hattie inhaled slowly, her gratitude carefully laced in measured grace. Thank you, but I'd prefer that no other elderly woman or any woman is ever spoken to like that again. Fix that and we'll be even. Mr. Reynolds nodded solemnly. We will, starting today. He turned back to Denise. We'll talk after this meeting. Clear your calendar. She swallowed hard and stepped away silently. Mark, still seated, looked up at Miss Hattie with pride. You handled that like a queen, he said. I was just trying not to say something I'd regret, she replied with a smile. But I do hope this becomes more than a one-day apology. People forget so quickly. Not if I can help it, Mark said. People need to hear this story. Not for sympathy, but for awareness. You'd be surprised how many people don't believe this kind of thing still happens, she added. Oh, I believe it, he replied. And now a lot more people will too. As the branch returned to its awkward normalcy, several customers came up to Miss Hattie. Some to apologize, others to thank her for speaking up. Even Janelle returned quietly and said, You taught me something today. Thank you. Miss Hattie nodded, offering her a kind pat on the hand. Lessons not just in books, baby. Sometimes it's in standing tall when it'd be easier to walk away. The presence of Mr. Reynolds had already transformed the tone of the branch, but the arrival of additional regional staff signaled that this was no longer just a routine complaint. It was now a matter being escalated across multiple levels of the company. 2 more officials in tailored suits entered the lobby with quiet urgency, followed closely by a corporate communications manager who began discreetly asking about the bank's internal security footage. The room, once filled with tension and embarrassment, now buzzed with the unmistakable energy of damage control. Miss Hattie remained composed, sitting at the consultation desk like a matriarch presiding over a family meeting, unshaken by the sudden swarm of authority figures. Mark stood nearby, still acting more like a silent protector than a celebrity. His arms crossed as he watched the unfolding scene with the same seriousness that had drawn him into the situation to begin with. Mr. Reynolds returned from a brief meeting in Denise's office, his expression even sterner than before. Miss Dupree, he said, my colleagues have reviewed the staff conduct logs, and unfortunately, this isn't the first complaint involving Travis. It is, however, the first time it's been witnessed by someone who wasn't afraid to speak up. He glanced at Mark with a grateful nod, then continued. Effective immediately, Travis has been terminated. Denise will be placed on administrative review pending further investigation. A small gasp escaped from one of the tellers, and for a moment, the entire bank felt like it was holding its breath. We've also contacted our National Ethics and Conduct Department, Mr. Reynolds added, and based on your experience, they've decided to fast-track an initiative we've had in planning stages for over a year, mandatory racial bias and age discrimination training for all branch-level staff, effective nationwide. Miss Hattie said nothing at first. She stared at him thoughtfully, then finally asked, and how will you measure whether that training actually changes anything? The question was sharp, cutting past the fluff of corporate promises and landing exactly where it needed to. Mr. Reynolds didn't flinch. We've hired external auditors and community consultants. One of the things we'd like to do is form a panel of local leaders to evaluate our progress quarterly. And I'd be honored if you'd consider joining that panel. Mark grinned quietly, watching Miss Hattie nod slowly, the wheels already turning in her mind. You don't just want me to help fix this bank, she said. You want me to help fix all of them. If you're willing, Reynolds replied. I am, she said, but not as a token. I want to be listened to. You have my word, he promised. Meanwhile, the corporate communications manager approached and gently asked Miss Hattie if she'd be open to making a public statement for the bank's official channels. She thought for a long moment, then declined. This isn't a media moment, she said. This is a human moment. Let the work speak before the cameras do. Mark looked at her with admiration, seeing clearly why she was a pillar in her community. As the bank tried to return to normal, Miss Hattie's account was upgraded on the spot. She was assigned a personal banker, a direct contact in corporate, and given a promise that her literacy initiative would receive financial support under the bank's Community Development Grant Program. But perhaps more meaningful than the upgrades and policy promises was what happened next. One by one, the employees began to approach her, not out of obligation but from an emerging sense of accountability. Janelle came first, her voice quivering with emotion. "I knew it was wrong, but I didn't know what to say. I'm sorry I didn't step in sooner." Miss Hattie touched her hand gently. "It's never too late to do the right thing, child." Others followed, some offering apologies, others expressing genuine regret. Even the security guard, once passive and distant, approached with lowered eyes and said, "I should have said something. I'm sorry, ma'am." She nodded, accepting each apology with the kind of humility that didn't erase pain, but instead turned it into a stepping stone for healing. Mark, still nearby, finally broke his silence with a light smile. "You just changed the whole temperature of this place, without raising your voice once." Miss Hattie gave a knowing glance. Sometimes, all it takes is for people to finally look up. As the crowd around her grew, a few customers asked for her contact details to volunteer for her literacy program. A young mother handed her a card, saying her own mother never learned to read and had always dreamed of finishing school. "Bring her by," Miss Hattie said. "We'll take good care of her." The regional staff gathered to debrief briefly before leaving, and as they exited, they passed by Mark and Miss Hattie, shaking their hands with deep respect. The bank had been merely a building that morning, a place where transactions happened and people passed each other like shadows. But by afternoon, it had become something else entirely. A space where truth cracked through protocol, and dignity stood tall enough to cast a shadow of its own. When the final apology was spoken and the last executive had shaken Miss Hattie's hand, the bank slowly returned to its regular rhythm, though it moved with a different cadence now, one marked by humility and introspection. What had started as a simple visit to deposit a check had transformed into a moment of reckoning, not just for the branch, but for everyone who bore silent witness to how easily dignity could be stripped, and how powerfully it could be reclaimed. Mark stayed behind as most of the staff dispersed, still seated near Miss Hattie as she neatly gathered her folder and checkbook, her hands moving with the slow precision of someone who never rushed for the sake of anyone's comfort. The security guard held the door open with an unspoken apology in his stance as the two walked out side by side, the sunlight pouring over them like a final curtain call on the morning's long performance. "Would you mind if I drove you home?" Mark asked as they reached the curb. "You've been through enough for one day." Miss Hattie gave him a look that mixed amusement with mild suspicion. "Mark Wahlberg offering rides to old ladies now?" He chuckled. "Only the ones who make me feel like I just met royalty." She raised an eyebrow but nodded, and moments later, they were gliding through her neighborhood in a sleek black SUV, the cityscape stretching out beyond the windshield. As they drove, Mark asked about her life, and Miss Hattie told him stories that wove history and humanity together in seamless threads. She spoke of marching in the 60s, of teaching during desegregation, of watching her community rise and fall and rise again. She spoke of her husband, gone now for 10 years, and of the library he helped build in the church basement. Mark listened like a student, asking questions, laughing in all the right places, growing quieter in the moments where pain still echoed in her voice. By the time they pulled up in front of her modest 2-story home with the porch swing and flower boxes, he wasn't ready for the conversation to end. "I meant what I said back there," he told her as he walked her to the door. "I want to help with that literacy project, however I can. Funding, promotion, volunteers, you name it." She paused, one hand on the screen door, the other holding her purse. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," he said. "I've got a platform, and if I can use it to make sure people like you get the respect you deserve, I'm all in." For the first time that day, emotion cracked through her composure, her eyes glistening with gratitude that came not from being rescued, but from being seen, fully and clearly. "You've got a good heart, Mark Wahlberg. That's rarer than people think." He nodded, offering a soft smile. "So do you, Miss Hattie. So do you." Over the next few weeks, the story of what happened at the bank traveled further than anyone expected. Not through tabloid headlines or scandal-hungry media outlets, but through genuine word of mouth, community forums, and a heartfelt postmark made on his social media account with a photo of him and Miss Hattie on her porch. Today, I met a woman who reminded me what strength, grace, and resilience really look like. The caption read, "Miss Hattie is a community hero, and I was lucky to witness her stand tall in the face of disrespect. We've got work to do, and I'm honored to help her do it." The post went viral not because of Mark's fame, but because of Miss Hattie's story. Soon, donations began to pour in for her literacy program. Volunteers signed up from across the city. A small local news station did a segment on her, and within days, she was invited to speak at the very first diversity and inclusion conference hosted by the bank's national leadership team. She didn't want to go at first. "I'm not a speaker," she insisted. "I'm a teacher. There's a difference." But Mark, seated across from her at her kitchen table, sipping tea and surrounded by notebooks filled with her curriculum plans, looked her dead in the eyes. "You taught a whole room without saying a word that day. You don't need a podium to teach people how to be better." With that, she agreed, and when the day came, she stepped on stage in front of hundreds of employees and executives. Her voice calm, deliberate, and unforgettable. She didn't shame, didn't scold. She told the truth about assumptions, about the erosion of empathy, about how small acts of disrespect build walls that only love, patience, and direct action can break down. Her speech became the centerpiece of the conference, shared in internal emails and training materials across the company. She returned home that evening not to silence, but to a porch full of thank you notes from neighbors, students, and even strangers. Mark continued to visit, sometimes to talk strategy, sometimes just to listen. Their friendship grew naturally, not out of charity or spectacle, but out of mutual respect. She'd tell him when his ideas were half-baked, and he'd tease her for refusing to use the fancy iPad he bought her, preferring her paper ledger and colored tabs. They were an unlikely duo, but somehow they made perfect sense. In time, the literacy program expanded to 3 neighborhoods, then 5, with Miss Hattie training new volunteers and ensuring every adult who walked through those doors left feeling like their story mattered. What began as a humiliating moment inside a cold bank lobby had ignited a movement shaped not by outrage, but by purpose. And as for Miss Hattie, she never let that day define her. Instead, she let it remind the world that dignity isn't something anyone can give or take. It's something you carry, quietly, until the right moment arrives to show everyone just how powerful it truly is.